March 23, 1945, the Western Front. The night is cold and heavy with silence. The war is almost over. But on this frozen stretch of the Rhine, no one feels safe enough to backsleeve it. On a ridge overlooking the valley near the German town of Wesel, a group of Wehrmacht soldiers scan the darkness through their binoculars. They see what looks like an American armored column moving toward the river. Hundreds of tanks, trucks, and troop carriers crawling across the fields. They hear engines rumbling, metal tracks grinding through mud. The earth seems to shake. The lieutenant in charge lowers his field glasses and calls into his radio. Enemy armor approaching from the west. Estimated 1 division, possibly more. Within minutes, German command posts are buzzing with reports. Reinforcements are ordered forward. Artillery adjusts its range. Officers draw thick red arrows across their maps. Another Allied push, another fight to the death. But what those soldiers are seeing, what they're hearing, and what they're preparing to fight isn't real. It's an illusion. One carefully staged by an American unit so secret, even most Allied officers didn't know it existed. And this is the story of that deception. How the German army was fooled by the U.S. Ghost Army. A handful of men who used creativity, art, and sound to wage one of the strangest battles of the entire war. A few miles behind the line, in a quiet field hidden by darkness, the attack is being prepared, not by tank crews or infantry, but by artists and engineers in army uniforms, under the faint glow of lanterns. They unroll enormous bundles of rubber, attach air hoses, and start inflating what look like tanks within minutes. The shapes take form. The familiar outlines of Sherman turrets, the long barrels of 75mm guns, the squat bodies of jeeps and armored cars. Each one weighs barely 100 pounds and can be lifted by 4 men. Yet to a spy with binoculars, or to a pilot flying overhead, they look completely real. The soldiers arrange them in neat rows, adding fake tire tracks in the mud, placing empty fuel drums and crates for authenticity. By the time the moon is high, a full armored camp seems to have appeared from nowhere. Then comes the sound. Engineers wheel out large speakers mounted on trucks, the same kind used for concerts back home, and load reels of magnetic tape recorded by Bell Labs. The recordings are real. The noise of tanks idling, engines revving, gears grinding, shouted commands. When played together, they create a moving wall of sound that rolls across the valley. To anyone listening from the German side, it sounds like hundreds of engines preparing to move at dawn. Soon, German radio operators confirm the reports. Listening stations pick up the noise of armored units. Intelligence officers study aerial photographs and see the shapes of vehicles lined up for attack. Everything fits. Every sign points to a major Allied offensive crossing the Rhine near Wesel. But all of it, every tank, every truck, every sound is fake. The Germans are staring into a masterpiece of deception, created by a group of men called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army. They are painters, architects, sound engineers, and designers turned soldiers. Their job isn't to fight, but to pretend, to make a few hundred men look like tens of thousands, to move imaginary divisions across the map and make the enemy believe every inch of it. They use paint instead of bullets, rubber instead of steel, and recordings instead of artillery. Yet what they achieve this night will shift the entire German defense line and save thousands of real soldiers fighting elsewhere. In the darkness, the Ghost Army men move quickly, checking their setup. Some are dressed as fake officers, wearing insignia from non-existent divisions. They drive jeeps through nearby towns, letting German spies see them. They speak loudly about the coming attack, knowing that enemy ears are always listening. It's all part of the act. A theater of war played out under the nose of the enemy. And on the other side of the Rhine, the Germans believe every moment of it. They tighten their defenses near Wesel, ready for an American breakthrough that will never come. Meanwhile, the real Allied forces prepared across the river miles away. Where the German lines are now dangerously thin, the plan works perfectly by dawn. The ridge overlooking the valley is still shrouded in mist. Through it, the faint outlines of tanks can still be seen. To the German spotters, it looks like a massive invasion force waiting for the signal to move. They send another report to headquarters. Enemy armor still in position. Attack expected soon, but the men of the Ghost Army are already packing up. The inflatable tanks are deflated. folded, and loaded back onto trucks. The speakers are turned off. The fake soldiers melt into the countryside in a few hours. The valley is empty again, except for the echo of engines that never existed. And on the far bank of the Rhine, the German army stands ready to fight a shadow. That is how the deception began. The night the Germans were fooled by an army that wasn't real, a ghostly force made of air, paint, and sound. By the spring of 1945, the German army was no longer the machine it once was. Its divisions were scattered, its fuel almost gone, and its soldiers weary from retreat after retreat. Yet the Germans still fought hard, believing that if they could hold the Rhine, they might stall the Allies long enough to negotiate peace. That's what made the deception of the Ghost Army so powerful. It played on Germany's last remaining weapon, fear. On the morning after that strange night near Wessel, German scouts ventured out to confirm what they had seen. They found tire marks in the mud, the faint outlines of tracks left by heavy vehicles. From a distance, they saw what looked like rows of Sherman tanks, their turrets glinting in the pale sunlight. Reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead and brought back blurry photographs showing armored columns stretching across open fields. The evidence seemed clear. American armor was massing for a crossing. What the Germans couldn't know was that almost everything in those photographs was made of rubber and air. The fake tanks were carefully positioned by a small team of men from the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Working under the cover of night, each inflatable vehicle took only 20 minutes to assemble. Yet when placed correctly and viewed from the right angle, it looked as solid and menacing as the real thing. But the Ghost Army didn't stop at visuals. They understood that deception needed layers. It had to sound real, look real, and even move like the real thing. Along nearby roads, sound crews rolled their trucks into position. They carried giant speakers that could project recorded engine noise across 10 miles of countryside. The sounds weren't random. Each sequence was crafted to mimic real military activity. The team at Bell Labs back in the States had recorded every kind of vehicle in the U.S. Army, from jeeps to half-tracks to heavy tanks, then layered those sounds so they could simulate anything from a small patrol to a full division on the move. When played through multiple speakers at different distances, the illusion was astonishing. German sound detectors picked up what they believed were engine concentrations, matching exactly what their scouts had reported. To them, the enemy buildup was undeniable. And then came the final touch, movement. The Ghost Army's trucks didn't stay still. The men repositioned their inflatables and sound equipment regularly, mimicking the movement of advancing columns. They even left behind fake campfires, empty ration tins, and tire marks in the mud. At times, they drove their trucks in visible routes during daylight, ensuring local German informants would notice and pass along reports. Everything was staged like a grand theater production, except the audience was the enemy. To the Germans, the illusion was total. They reported that the Americans were preparing a major crossing. They shifted their artillery, called in reinforcements, and moved precious fuel reserves toward what they believed would be the next battlefield. Meanwhile, miles away, the real American forces were crossing the Rhine under far lighter resistance. Every man misdirected to Wessel was one less facing the genuine invasion. Among the Ghost Army soldiers, there was a strange pride in their invisible work. They knew they might never receive public credit. Secrecy was vital. If the Germans ever discovered that these men were only a few hundred strong, the illusion would collapse. Their greatest weapon was not strength but belief. One sergeant later recalled that when the operation succeeded, we didn't cheer. We just laughed. Because we'd fooled the German army with paint and noise. That was the Ghost Army's art. Turning imagination into armor, and silence into safety. But who were these men, really? Who were the artists fighting a war of shadows? That story begins years earlier, in a very different kind of battlefield, the studios, schools and workshops of America. When the United States entered World War II, its military needed more than soldiers. It needed ideas across the Atlantic. German forces had perfected the art of deception, fake airfields, dummy aircraft, and entire phantom divisions meant to confuse Allied bombers. The U.S. Army wanted to do the same, but better. So in 1944, a new kind of unit was born, one that would use creativity as a weapon. Officially, it was called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Unofficially, it became known as the Ghost Army. Its members came from unlikely places. Many were art students, architects, and designers from New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Some had worked in advertising. Others had studied theater or sound engineering. A few had even painted billboards on city streets before the war. These were not hardened soldiers. They were young men with sketchbooks, cameras, and wild imaginations, the kind of people who thought in color and light, not in tactics and gunfire. The army gave them uniforms, training, and an impossible task: to create an army out of thin air. Their weapons would be inflatable tanks, fake radio signals, and the power of suggestion. Their battles would be fought not to kill the enemy, but to make him believe something that wasn't true. The Ghost Army was organized like a traveling theater troupe. There were 4 main sections: visual deception, sound deception, radio deception, and a small security team to protect them in case the act went wrong. The visual deception unit built and deployed the inflatable tanks and vehicles. These props were designed by engineers who had studied how light, distance, and perspective worked in aerial reconnaissance photos. A shadow in the right place could make a 2-foot-high rubber turret look like solid steel. The sound unit, led by engineers from Bell Labs, handled the recordings using state-of-the-art audio equipment. They could project a moving armored column or a full battlefront from miles away. The sound library included over 1,000 different effects, recorded from real tanks, trucks, and artillery units at Fort Knox. The radio team, trained in the techniques of counterintelligence, created entire networks of fake transmissions. They studied the habits of real American divisions, learning how operators spoke, the rhythm of their messages, even their personal quirks. When German codebreakers intercepted those transmissions, they matched perfectly with known units, confirming the illusion. Finally, the security detachment acted as actors on the stage. They posed as officers, set up fake headquarters, and even visited nearby towns dressed in full uniform, loudly discussing secret plans in cafes and shops where German informants might overhear. Every word, every gesture was part of the act. The result was a deception so complete that even friendly Allied units sometimes mistook them for real reinforcements. There were moments when American tank crews tried to refuel or take orders from the Ghost Army, only to discover that the vehicles they were approaching were hollow. But the Ghost Army's greatest strength wasn't the props or the technology. It was the people. They understood human psychology. They knew that war, at its core, depends on what people believe. And belief, when carefully guided, can be more powerful than any weapon. When they weren't building illusions, many of these soldiers still carried their art with them. Some sketched portraits of their comrades by candlelight. Others painted ruined villages or quiet moments between missions. Their notebooks, still preserved today, are filled with drawings of tanks, tents, and faces, all mixed together like pieces of 2 different worlds: art and war. In one sketch, a young soldier drew himself standing beside an inflatable Sherman. His hand resting on its rubber hull, he wrote beneath it, "If only all wars were made of air." The Ghost Army didn't just create fake divisions. They created hope. Every time their deception worked, real soldiers somewhere else were spared a deadly fight. And as the war pressed deeper into Germany, their illusions became bolder, their tricks more elaborate, until entire enemy armies were chasing shadows. The stage was set for their greatest performance of all, a symphony of sound and illusion that would convince the Germans they were facing an American force 10 times its real size. That story would unfold with the roar of engines that never existed, and the light of fires that burned only in imagination. By the summer of 1944, the Ghost Army had turned deception into a science. Every sound, every light, every whisper across a radio was part of an invisible performance, one that could move entire divisions without firing a shot. Their operations followed a pattern that they called the art of illusion in 4 acts. The first act was appearance. Make the enemy see what isn't there. The second was sound. Make him hear it. The third was movement. Make it feel alive. And the final act was disappearance. Vanish before he can understand the trick. In the fields of northern France, those lessons came to life. It began at dusk, when the countryside still smelled of rain and fuel. Ghost Army trucks rolled down dirt roads, their headlights dimmed, their drivers silent at a chosen clearing. Teams jumped down and began unloading equipment. Some carried folded fabric and coiled air hoses. Others carried long boxes of electrical cables, speakers, and amplifiers. Within an hour, the first sounds began. It started with a low hum, so deep you could feel it before you heard it. The throb of diesel engines idling in the dark. Then came the metallic clatter of tracks, layered and echoed through the valley. The sound crew, trained by engineers from Bell Labs, worked from recordings made on real battlefields. They could reproduce not just tanks but entire convoys, a sonic illusion stretching across miles. Each operation was rehearsed like a stage play. Crews knew exactly when to move the phantom tanks, when to simulate maintenance noise, when to fade the sound of engines as if an armored column were advancing. Loudspeakers, each the size of a refrigerator, were arranged in patterns that gave the illusion of distance and direction. A passing soldier once described it as hearing an entire army march by in the dark, but seeing no one. For German scouts, it was impossible to tell the difference. Their microphones detected the vibrations. Their listening stations confirmed engine noise consistent with hundreds of armored vehicles. Even pilots flying overhead reported what they believed to be real troop movements. But the men of the Ghost Army didn't stop at sound. They knew that light could tell a story too. As night deepened, small teams scattered across the countryside, placing flickering lamps behind hills and inside fake tents to mimic campfires and lanterns. They moved trucks with headlights shielded by narrow slits, creating the illusion of long columns weaving through the night. Some soldiers called it painting with light. The illusion was so effective that one night, a nervous American patrol stumbled upon the operation and reported an entire division bivouacked in the woods. They had to be told quietly that the division wasn't real. The Ghost Army learned to blend theater and warfare seamlessly. Every operation was a dance between risk and invisibility. Too much activity and they could be discovered. Too little, and the illusion would fail. In August 1944, they reached the height of their craft during the push toward the River Loire. As Allied forces advanced across France, the Ghost Army was ordered to create a diversion that would convince the Germans an armored division was preparing to strike from the south. They had less than 12 hours to do it. By dawn, they had filled the fields with over 100 inflatable tanks, 30 dummy artillery pieces, and hundreds of fake trucks. The sound crews blasted recordings of engines and gunfire. The radio operators sent false messages describing non-existent units moving into position. From the German perspective, the buildup was unmistakable. Enemy reconnaissance planes photographed the site and reported a full armored division massing south of the Loire. The German High Command reacted immediately, shifting 2 entire divisions to meet the supposed threat. But when they arrived, the Americans were gone. The fields were empty except for a few deflated rubber tanks fluttering in the wind. The trick had worked again. The Germans had moved to fight a phantom, leaving the real American advance unopposed. Later that year, a soldier from the Ghost Army wrote in his diary, "We win our battles with air and sound, but the silence afterward feels heavier than victory." Because when the speakers were turned off and the lights went out, the men were left alone in the dark, unarmed, exposed, and surrounded by a war they could not reveal they were fighting. Their next act would take the deception to an even deeper level, not just fooling the eyes or ears, but the German intelligence network itself. The Ghost Army's success depended on one crucial thing: communication. If their visual and sound effects fooled the eye and ear, their radio deception fooled the mind. The German military relied heavily on intercepted radio messages to track Allied movements. At times, the Ghost Army ran full-scale radio plays. Several operators worked together, sending different messages that, when pieced together, painted the illusion of a massive troop buildup. It was a story told in code, a story the Germans believed. The consequences were very real. In one operation in late 1944, their fake transmissions convinced the German command that the U.S. Ninth Army was preparing an offensive near Metz. In truth, the real attack would come more than 50 miles north. German units redeployed to meet the phantom threat, leaving the actual front dangerously weak. The deception saved countless lives, but the danger to the Ghost Army was constant. Unlike traditional units, they had no heavy weapons. If the Germans discovered who they really were, a few hundred unarmed men with rubber tanks and tape machines, they would be wiped out in minutes. One evening near the town of Verdun, a German reconnaissance patrol stumbled dangerously close to their camp. The Ghost Army soldiers froze instead of fighting. They switched tactics, playing loud engine sounds and shouting false orders to give the impression of overwhelming numbers. The patrol withdrew, reporting that they had encountered a large mechanized force. Once again, illusion had replaced violence. The unit's commanders, Colonel Harry Reeder and Major Ralph Ingersoll, understood that deception could be as decisive as firepower. They planned each operation with surgical precision, studying enemy reconnaissance routes and weather patterns. The goal was not just to fool the Germans, but to make the lie fit within the truth sometimes. The Ghost Army even used local civilians to help spread misinformation. Soldiers posing as engineers or staff officers would visit nearby villages, speaking just loudly enough for potential informants to overhear their plans. Within days, those rumors would reach German intelligence. When the next aerial photographs confirmed the reports, the deception was sealed. The effectiveness of these operations astonished Allied command. General Omar Bradley once remarked that the Ghost Army's work saved thousands of lives by diverting enemy forces away from real offensives. General George Patton, known for his aggression, quietly relied on their tricks to mask his movements before major assaults. But for the men of the Ghost Army, the victories were always bittersweet. They lived in secrecy, knowing they could never reveal what they had done. One radio operator later said, "Our greatest success was when no one knew we were there." In the chaos of the European front, truth and illusion blurred together. Entire German units were sent chasing ghosts, phantom armies that existed only in sound, light, and rumor. The Germans began to doubt their own intelligence. Reports contradicted one another. Divisions were ordered to defend areas where no enemy appeared. Officers hesitated to act, uncertain whether what they saw was real. By winter, confusion had become a weapon more powerful than any bomb. The Ghost Army had transformed the battlefield into a stage where the enemy's own certainty became his undoing. And as the war drew to its end, their illusions would reach their most daring and dangerous moment. A grand deception so large that it would rewrite the map of the final campaign in Europe. That was the moment when they would bluff the Reich itself. By March of 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final act. The Allies had crossed the Rhine and were closing in on the heart of Germany. But even as defeat loomed, the German army still fought with desperate strength. Town by town, field by field, they resisted, determined to make the enemy pay for every mile. And once again, the Ghost Army stepped onto the stage, this time for their most daring deception of all. Their target was the German defensive line near the city of Wesel. The plan was simple but dangerous: to convince the Germans that a massive American force, the Ninth Army, was preparing to attack across one sector of the Rhine, while the real crossing would happen somewhere else. For the Germans, this was a nightmare scenario. A successful crossing would open the path to the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heart. Losing it would mean losing the war, so the men of the Ghost Army had to make their illusion perfect. They began by arriving in broad daylight, wearing the insignia of real divisions that were, in truth, fighting miles away. They let themselves be seen, deliberately, driving through villages, inspecting maps, setting up roadblocks, and giving orders in loud, confident voices. They wanted German spies and local informants to take note. By night, they transformed empty fields into a fortress of shadows. Dozens of inflatable tanks lined the riverbank, their painted hulls catching the moonlight. Dummy artillery barrels pointed east toward the enemy. Truck headlights flashed in patterns to mimic supply convoys arriving through the night. Then came the sounds, the unmistakable roar of armor and heavy equipment. The loudspeakers rumbled with recorded engine noise, hammering through the valley like a living heartbeat. German microphones detected it immediately. To their intelligence officers, the message was clear. An armored division was massing on the western bank. But the Ghost Army didn't stop there. Their radio operators went to work, filling the air with coded chatter about bridge-building materials, fuel shortages, and orders for assault boats. Every message matched the style and language of the real Ninth Army. When German codebreakers intercepted them, they concluded that a major crossing was imminent. The Germans reacted exactly as hoped. They shifted their artillery and infantry to reinforce the Wesel sector. Commanders called for reserves to move north, thinning their defenses elsewhere along the Rhine. Miles away, at a quieter stretch of the river, the real American forces began their crossing almost unopposed. While thousands of real soldiers risked their lives on fragile pontoon bridges, the men of the Ghost Army sat in the dark, listening to the distant thunder of the real battle. Their work had drawn away the enemy's strength. For once, deception had saved more lives than any weapon could, but the illusion had to be maintained. For 3 nights, the Ghost Army kept up the act. They rotated fake patrols, flashed signals, and even played the sounds of artillery fire to mimic combat. From the German perspective, the front near Wesel was alive with activity. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished. At dawn on the 4th day, the field stood empty again. The tanks were gone, the radio silent, the tracks wiped away. All that remained were a few flattened patches of grass where rubber armor had once stood. When German reconnaissance planes flew over the site, they were baffled. Where had the division gone? They reported to headquarters that the enemy had withdrawn east, assuming the Americans had already crossed. The truth, that there had never been any division at all, never occurred to them. Later, Allied intelligence officers estimated that the Ghost Army's deception had diverted at least 2 full German divisions, saving thousands of American lives during the Rhine crossing. It was in every sense the perfect illusion, bold, complete, and invisible. Yet for the men who pulled it off, there was little time to celebrate. They packed up their inflatables, their sound trucks, and their radio gear, and moved on to the next operation. Their orders were always the same: leave no trace, tell no one, and never admit what they had done. One soldier later said, "It felt strange. We'd just tricked the German army into fighting shadows, and no one would ever know." But that was their role, to win battles that could never be claimed. And as the Reich crumbled, their ghosts faded with it. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, Europe was unrecognizable, cities lay in ruins, rivers ran black with oil and ash. The war that had consumed a continent was finally over. For the Ghost Army, victory came quietly. There were no medals, no parades, no official records. Their existence remained classified, their achievements hidden behind layers of secrecy. Most of them simply packed their bags and went home, to New York, to Ohio, to California, carrying memories they weren't allowed to share. They returned to their old lives as painters, architects, designers, and engineers. Some went on to become famous artists. Others slipped quietly into ordinary jobs. But all of them carried the same secret: that they had fought a war not with bullets but with imagination. For years, no one spoke of it. Families knew little. Friends assumed they had served in some obscure engineering unit. The truth stayed buried in military archives, sealed under the simple words, "classified operation." Only decades later would the world learn what these men had done. When the records were finally declassified in the 1990s, historians and journalists uncovered the story. A secret army of artists who had used sound, paint, and deception to confuse the German military across Europe. The truth was almost unbelievable, but the evidence was there. The photographs of rubber tanks lined up in French fields, the sound recordings from Bell Labs, the sketches drawn by soldiers who had turned war into a kind of performance art. Veterans of the Ghost Army began to speak publicly, many for the first time. Some laughed at the absurdity of it, that their weapon had been a paintbrush or an air pump. Others spoke with quiet pride. They knew how many lives their illusions had saved. One of them, a young art student during the war named Bill Blass, who would later become a world-famous fashion designer, described it simply: "We were artists trying to outwit an enemy. Our weapons were creativity and nerve." Another veteran, sound engineer Jack Macy, recalled nights spent crouched beside giant speakers, playing the noise of hundreds of tanks while hoping the Germans never discovered there were only 10 men behind it. "If they'd ever realized," he said, "we'd have been gone in 5 minutes." For them, the memory of fear was still sharp. The cold nights on the front line with no real weapons, the constant danger of discovery, the strange thrill of seeing their illusions come to life. When asked what they felt about their work, one veteran paused and said softly, "It was a war where no one had to die for us to win." Even today, the Ghost Army remains one of the most extraordinary stories of World War II. A story of creativity triumphing over destruction, of imagination used as a shield instead of a sword. In the end, they prove something profound: that art, when guided by courage and intelligence, could change the course of war. As the years passed, the surviving members grew old. Many didn't live to see their story told. But those who did were finally recognized in 2022. The U.S. Congress awarded the Ghost Army a Congressional Gold Medal. Honoring their bravery and brilliance, it was a tribute long overdue, not just to soldiers, but to artists who used their craft to save lives. And so the story of the Ghost Army came full circle. From the silent fields of the Rhine to the pages of history, from secrecy to remembrance. Back in 1945, as the war ended, a few of them stood together on the banks of the Rhine where their greatest illusion had taken place. The river moved quietly now, no longer echoing with the sounds of war. One man looked across the water and said, "If the Germans ever knew what we really were, they'd never believe it." He was right. Because what the German army saw that night was an army of steel and thunder. What really stood before them was an army of artists, armed with nothing but air, sound, and the power of imagination. And that is how the German army was fooled, not by force, but by the brilliance of a ghost. The war ended, but the echoes of its illusions remained. Across Europe, the scars of battle slowly faded. But the ghosts stayed, not the kind that haunt ruins, but the kind that remind us what imagination can do when guided by necessity and courage. For decades, the story of the Ghost Army was locked away in silence. Their files were marked classified. Their photographs sat in dusty archives. The men themselves grew older, their art careers blossoming in peacetime. Architects, designers, illustrators, teachers. Few ever spoke of what they had done. Only years later would historians uncover the truth, that an army of artists had once stood against the might of the Reich and won. Not through destruction but deception. The numbers were staggering. In over 20 operations, the Ghost Army had faked the presence of entire divisions, drawn fire from German artillery, and saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. They had been mistaken for Patton's Armored Corps, for the 2nd Infantry, for the 8th and the 12th, a shape-shifting army that existed everywhere and nowhere at once. And yet, for all their victories, they never claimed a single one. There were no medals, no fanfare, no songs of glory. Only the quiet satisfaction that their lies had spared men from dying for the truth. When their mission was finally declassified in the 1990s, the surviving veterans met again, gray-haired now, some walking with canes. Their sketches and memories spread across tables like old secrets finally brought into the light. They laughed as they told stories of air pumps failing, of rubber tanks collapsing in the rain, of German scouts who had run for cover from shadows. But when they spoke of what it meant, their voices softened. "We were pretending to be an army," one said. But the war around us was real. We could hear it every night if we failed. People would die. Their success wasn't measured in land captured or enemies destroyed, but in time stolen from chaos. The time they bought for others to live in the years since. Their work has come to symbolize something greater than strategy or cunning. It's a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, creativity can be a form of resistance, that art itself can be a weapon for peace, and there's a strange poetry to it all. At the start of the war, Hermann Göring, the once proud Luftwaffe commander, had mocked the idea that the Americans could deceive or outthink Germany. His arrogance, like the empire he served, was built on the illusion of invincibility. He believed in power measured by steel, by engines, by noise. But in the end, it was the Americans who mastered illusion. They turned Göring's own faith in might against him, proving that the strongest weapon isn't always the loudest one. He once bragged, "If enemy bombers ever reach the Ruhr, you may call me Meyer." The world remembers how that boast ended. In fire, in ruin, in the collapse of an empire. And yet here, on the quiet fields where the Ghost Army once stood, there was no fire, no ruin, no blood, there was only silence, and victory born of imagination. The German army had been fooled, not by might, but by mastery, not by strength, but by subtlety. The Ghost Army had rewritten the rules of war, showing that creativity could outsmart violence, that illusion could protect where destruction once ruled. As one veteran said, "We were ghosts who made the enemy see what we wanted them to see. But we weren't haunting them, we were saving our own." Today, their story stands as one of the most remarkable in the history of warfare. It reminds us that wars are not only fought with weapons, but with wit, courage, and the unyielding belief that art can still matter, even in the face of death, in a world once divided by fear and arrogance. The Ghost Army proves something timeless, that imagination, guided by purpose, can change the course of history. And so the story circles back to that night on the Rhine, to the German observers who watched shadows move across the fields and heard engines that were never there. They thought they saw an army made of steel and men. What they saw was an idea so powerful it fooled them all. That is how the German army was fooled by the U.S. Ghost Army, not with guns or fire, but with air, paint, and sound. And from those ghosts in a war built on destruction, rose one of the quietest, cleverest victories ever won.